The air on Tarian felt heavier than Earth, not just because of the high gravity, but because of the tension that hung thick around the ceremonial grounds. The wide circle of polished stone was surrounded by a massive crowd of Tariani citizens there. Tall forms, silent and watchful, as the ancient drums echoed across the valley, beneath the red twin suns standing near the edge of the arena. Callan adjusted his collar, once again wiping the sweat from his brow. The translator implant in his ear hummed, softly decoding the chants that rose and fell like waves in an ocean of sound. He was not used to this kind of atmosphere where the eyes of an entire alien civilization were fixed on a single tradition, one that dated back thousands of years. Callan had come here only as part of Earth's peaceful diplomatic mission, a medic trained to assist the cultural exchange team. His job was to study local biology, provide emergency aid, and learn as much as possible about Tariani healing arts. But no. One had warned him how deeply the Tariani people held to their warrior rituals, especially the ancient arrow ceremony, where bloodlines, honor, and fate were tested in front of everyone to determine who was worthy of leadership and legacy. In the center of the ring stood Reika, the chosen warrior, tall, graceful, fierce. Her armor shimmered with metal threads that moved like liquid light across her skin. Her dark eyes held the fire of someone who had trained since birth for moments like this. She held a long curved bow carved from the bone of a sea beast and wrapped with glyphs that glowed faintly with energy. The arrow she notched was not ordinary. It was the final one, the one that would determine the outcome of this challenge between her and another warrior who had dared to question her right to lead her clan. The wind shifted for a moment, and Callan felt a strange pull toward the scene. His human instincts told him something was off. The other warrior had stumbled just slightly, and the way Reika drew her bowstring so tight without hesitation, it all happened so fast. His mind raced with the thought that this was no longer about ritual, but about real danger. And just as Reika released the arrow, her target slipped on the polished stone, turning slightly away, leaving the arrow to fly straight toward his unprotected net. Before anyone could scream, Callan moved without thinking. His arm shot forward, and his body twisted with precision honed from years of emergency reaction training and field combat. He caught the arrow in mid-flight. The shaft vibrated in his hand, the force of it numbing his fingers, but it did not pierce skin, and no blood was drawn. The arena fell completely silent. The drums stopped, the chants froze, and all eyes now turned to him. Reika stood frozen, her bow lowered, her face unreadable, her eyes locked onto Callan as if she had just seen a ghost. The elders began to murmur. The chieftain raised his staff, and his voice boomed across the stones, declaring that the arrow bond had been invoked. Callan had performed the catch, a sacred act, which according to Tariani law meant he had accepted the challenge directed at the warrior, and by doing so had symbolically intercepted destiny itself. The consequence was clear and unchangeable. The catcher must now become the bonded. Translator buzzed in Callan's ear, but the words didn't make sense at first. Then it sank in. He had caught the sacred arrow during a ceremonial duel, and by Tariani tradition, this act was not seen as interference, but as a spiritual claim, a sacred vow. It meant he had chosen Reika as his partner, not just in battle, but in life. It meant they must be joined under the rites of union, a marriage sanctioned by the stars, and sealed in honor. Callan's legs almost gave out. He tried to speak, but the language caught in his throat. The crowd began to hum again, with low murmurs of shock, curiosity, disapproval, and awe. Reika still had not moved, her gaze never leaving him, and there was a storm building in her eyes, not of love, not of peace, but of anger, pride, and something like disbelief. Had come here to heal, not to interfere, and definitely not to marry a warrior of another world. But the arrow had been caught, the law had been spoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a copper hue across the mountain ridges as Callan followed the elders through narrow stone corridors carved into the cliffs. Each step, echoing in a chamber filled with silence, tradition weighed heavier than gravity here, and every eye that glanced at him held a mix of curiosity Judgment and a touch of ancient fear, he was taken to the Hall of Echoes, a sacred place where decisions, bound by law and time, were not only made, but remembered for generations. The walls were etched with glowing inscriptions that shifted gently as if alive, telling stories of those who had come before: warriors, champions, lovers, traitors. Each name, etched into the stone, carried a weight that stretched far beyond the moment. And now they were preparing to add his. He sat cross-legged in front of the elder table, where the oldest of the Tariani Council leaned forward, their long braids tied with silver threads, their skin marked by lines of age, wisdom, and ritual. They spoke with calm voices, but their words carried steel. Callan had invoked the Arrow Bond, a custom older than any agreement with off-worlders, a sacred rite that allowed no reversal. No argument, no diplomacy. To decline would be to shame the warrior, and, by extension, her clan, which would force her to challenge him in a duel to the death, or worse, trigger a call for blood among the tribes, and risk a diplomatic collapse with Earth's alliance mission. Callan tried to explain that he had acted on instinct, not knowing what the arrow meant, or the tradition behind it. But the elder with emerald eyes simply tilted her head and replied that intent was meaningless when the spirits had already accepted. The gesture to catch the arrow was not just to stop a weapon, it was to intercept fate, and when fate is touched by mortal hands, the laws of the ancients respond without delay. In the days that followed, Callan was kept within the ceremonial quarters. He was not a prisoner, but the guards outside made it clear. He was no longer free to walk without watch. His meals were brought with polite silence. His messages to the Earth Council went unanswered, perhaps blocked, perhaps delayed. And the translator in his ear constantly buzzed with updates on rituals, preparations, and responses from the clans around Tarian. The news of the arrow catch had already spread far and wide. Many clans saw it as a sign of renewal, a human joining their warrior bloodline. Was viewed by some as destiny, by others as blasphemer. Reka did not visit him, not for 3 days, not even once he asked, but received only short answers until finally a guard informed him that she had requested a meeting. Not as a bride, but as a challenger. Callan was brought to a quiet glade where stone pillars surrounded a spring, and there she waited, standing in silence. Dressed not in armor, but in the ceremonial robes of a bonded warrior, her gaze as sharp as ever. But her voice low and steady when she spoke. She told him the truth with no effort to soften it. She did not want him, she did not choose him, and she saw his catch as a foolish move, one that put her clan's honor at risk and chained her to a future she had not earned. In the way of her people, a bond made without mutual victory was a broken path, and she did not walk broken paths. Yet she could not challenge the law unless she wanted to bring shame to herself, which she would never allow. So she offered him a trial period, a shared month known as the Unity Season, where the bond could be tested without final sealing. If, by the end, they both stood before the flames and declared it void, then the law would release them without stain. Callan agreed, not because he wanted to escape, but because he saw no other path through the mess he had caused. He respected her strength, her fire, her discipline. He understood that love was not built in silence nor in ceremony, but maybe in something deeper, something earned through days of struggle and small truths. The trial would begin with the next sunrise, and they would live together, train together, eat, speak, move, and sleep under the same roof. Not as lovers, not as enemies, but as two who had been thrown together by law and were now bound to walk the same road. When he returned to the ceremonial quarters that night, he stood by the window watching the twin moons rise slowly above the cliffs. He wondered how things had changed so fast, how one movement of his hand had altered not just his future, but the course of two cultures. And yet in his heart, something stirred, not fear, not regret, but a spark of something new, something strange, like the quiet rhythm before a storm, or the first breath before a leap into the unknown. And in that moment, Callan did not sleep. Instead, he stood there listening to the wind whisper through the stone, and wondered what kind of story was about to begin between two people who never meant to belong to each other, yet were now bound by something older than choice. Morning on Tarian. arrived not with sunlight alone, but with the trembling hum of energy that moved across the valleys like invisible fire. The Unity season had begun, and with it Callan stepped into a world far different from anything he had known before. No longer a guest or an outsider, he now walked beside Reka in daily rituals bound by laws that neither of them had chosen, but both had to obey. The days began before sunrise with a trial of endurance, long runs across rocky paths where the air was thin and the gravity pressed against his bones like a second skin. The Tariani warriors moved with grace through the paths while Callan stumbled, fought to breathe, but never stopped. His legs ached and his heart pounded, yet something inside him refused to fall behind. Reka never spoke during those runs, but her silence spoke louder than words. Her eyes watched him like a flame, testing how long the wax could last. She did not mock him, nor did she help. She simply allowed the challenge to shape itself and let him choose how he would respond. And as the days passed, Callan grew steadier. His steps found rhythm. His breath adjusted to the strange air. His body learned to move like there's not with power alone, but with flow, with the language of survival that came from the land itself. After training, they shared meals made from thick root vegetables and crimson grains, flavored with sharp spices and cooled with blue nectar that tingled on the tongue. Reka prepared the meals in silence, but Callan always offered thanks even when she only nodded without looking at him. The bond between them was not built in conversation, but in the way she sharpened two blades and handed him one without speaking, in the way she stepped aside to let him pass through a narrow trail instead of walking ahead, in the way she stood still beside him at night while the moons rose and the silence became less like distance and more like breath. One evening, deep into the third week, a message arrived from the outer border. A hunting party had not returned from the cliffs where wild creatures nested. Reka answered the call without hesitation, preparing her weapons and calling for her mount, a beast with black wings and 4 eyes that shimmered like stars. Callan insisted on going with her, not to fight, but to assist if anyone was injured. Reka said nothing, only tossed him a light blade and turned her back, which meant yes in the language of her people. They flew fast over jagged peaks where the wind cut like knives, and the ground far below seemed to spin with clouds and steam. They found the missing hunters in a narrow ravine, cornered by a beast that looked like living stone with 6 legs and a roar that cracked the air. One warrior was already down, poison spreading through his veins while the others fought to distract the monster. Reka launched into battle without fear, her movements sharp and fluid like a blade through smoke, while Callan crawled toward the fallen hunter, pulling out his field kit and working fast, his hands steady, even as the beast roared above them. He saved the warrior's life, not with strength, but with knowledge, injecting the antidote and sealing the wound with a stabilizer patch, even as dust rained down from the shaking cliffs. And when the beast turned toward him, Reka's arrow found its mark, straight through its glowing eye, ending the battle in silence. She turned to him and said for the first time something more than a command. She said, "You did not run," and he replied, "I did not come here to watch people die." Her eyes met his, and in that brief moment, something passed between them, not warmth, not yet, but understanding. The first stone laid on a bridge between 2 hearts. The days that followed changed slowly, like the turning of a great wheel. Reka began asking him questions about Earth, about the oceans he had seen, and the skies of his childhood, and he asked her about the mountain songs of her people, and the trials she passed to earn her bow. They laughed. Only once during a strange food test, when he accidentally ate a spice that made his skin glow green for hours, and Reka did not mock him. She simply shook her head and handed him water, and for some reason that moment stayed with him longer. Then the day of the arrow, Callan began to understand her in ways beyond words. The grief hidden in her strength, the weight she carried from a brother lost in a duel long ago, the distrust she held toward outsiders because one had once broken a vow and left her people in shame. He saw her not just as a warrior, but as a protector, one who had learned to fight not out of hate, but because she had no choice, and Reka began to see him not as a fragile outsider, but as someone who chose to endure. Not for glory, not for pride, but because his heart refused to leave anyone behind. The bond between them had started with law, but now something else had begun to grow, something without name, without demand, just a quiet sense that perhaps the arrow had not been a mistake. Perhaps it had flown where it was always meant to go. And as the sun dipped behind the high cliffs that night, and the stars blinked into view, Callan stood beside Reka at the edge of a lake where the water glowed softly with life. He did not speak, and neither did she, but when their hands brushed, neither of them pulled away, and in the stillness of that moment, two worlds drifted closer without a single word to guide them. The last days of Unity season came with golden winds that flowed down from the high mountains, carrying petals from the skyflowers that only bloomed once every cycle. And as those delicate petals danced through the air, Reka stood at the training ground watching Callan move through a combat sequence she had taught him herself. His posture was still too human, too grounded, too focused on weight rather than flow. But his timing had improved, his footwork more precise, his breath more in tune with the rhythm of movement rather than the effort. And though she said nothing as she watched, something inside her softened like stone. Warming beneath sunlight, Callan had changed in ways he could not see, but others did. He had become quieter, not in fear, but in awareness. He spoke less and listened more. He learned the stories carved into the trees. He memorized the patterns of the stars as they changed in the twin sun sky. He began using Tariani greetings with sincerity, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand the people around him. And most of all, he no longer looked at Reka like a puzzle or a danger or a mystery. Instead, he looked at her like she was real, a person, not just a warrior bound by ancient laws, but someone who chose strength every day and carried the weight of those choices with silent dignity. But peace is never untouched for long. And as the last week of the season approached, a voice rose from the gathering circle. It was Torin, a tall, proud warrior from Reka's clan who had long believed himself destined to stand beside her in union. He stepped forward with sharp eyes and fire in his tone, demanding a trial to claim what was rightfully his by strength and tradition. He had trained beside Reka since childhood, fought in battles, earned scars and honors, and now he challenged Callan before the Unity flames, not out of hate, but because the law allowed it, and he believed he would. When Reka said nothing, her silence unreadable. As the council accepted the challenge, the rules were clear. A final trial, not to the death, but to the limit of will, a contest of strength, endurance, spirit, and clarity. The winner would have the right to complete or dissolve the bond, and the decision would be final. Torin trained with blade and fire. Callan prepared in quiet with breath and purpose. He knew he could not match Torin in strength, but strength was not what he had come to offer. He spent his nights walking through the ancestral gardens, touching the memory stones of past unions, reading the names of those who had found love in places they never expected. And each morning he woke with clarity, not to win, but to show who he had become. The trial began under the twin suns, watched by hundreds gathered around the great stone ring, the air thick with tension. As Torin stepped forward, his muscles coiled like rope, his presence a roar before a strike. And Callan entered without armor, only a light blade at his hip, and his eyes steady. Reka sat at the high bench, her hands resting on the carved arms, her expression still and unreadable, but her heart raced with every breath. They clashed not in fury, but in purpose. Torin moved with practiced violent strikes, sharp and clean, while Callan moved like water, dodging, deflecting, never meeting force with force, only redirecting it, letting each attack pass beside him rather than through him. Torin mocked him at first, but Callan never answered with words. He simply endured and adapted, and when Torin finally struck too wide and stumbled, Callan had a chance to bring him down, yet he stepped back and offered a hand, not to end him, but to lift him. Crowd murmured, unsure how to respond to a warrior who refused to claim victory through dominance. But Reka stood and raised her hand. signaling that the trial had ended not in defeat, not in surrender, but in a kind of understanding that could not be forced. Torrin stared at Callan for a long moment, then took his hand and rose, nodding once and leaving the circle without anger. Callan turned and met Reka's gaze, and for the first time she smiled not with her lips, but with her eyes. And in that moment, something inside her opened like a gate. Long sealed later that night beneath the starlit sky, Callan and Reka stood alone near the lake where their hands had first touched. She told him of the burden she had carried all her life, the pressure to be perfect, to protect her clan, to honor her brother's memory who had died when an outsider broke the bond and left her people stained with dishonor. She told him how she had hated the law that gave others power over her choices, and how she feared the arrow she had fired would curse her with another empty promise. But she also told him that something had changed, not because of words or gestures, but because he had stayed. He had faced her trials. He had learned her world not to win her, but to understand her. Callan listened, and then he said nothing for a while, only looking at the reflection of the moons on the water, and then he said that if the bond must end, he would accept it with respect, and if it must continue, he would honor it, not because of law, not because of pride, but because of the way her voice slowed when she spoke in truth, and because when she smiled with her eyes he felt the pull of something real. As they stood together, the air shifted, and the petals began to fall again, soft and glowing, like the sky itself had begun to weep gentle light. And Reka reached out without words and took his hand, her grip strong, warm, steady, and in that silent touch a decision was made, not by force or law, but by heart. And when they returned to the village, the flames of unity burned brighter than ever before, ready to witness a bond no longer built by accident, but by choice between two souls who had learned to walk together through fire and silence and wind and sky. The dawn rose slower than usual, as if the very sky knew something important was about to take place. The valley shimmered under the golden breath of twin suns, and every ridge, every stone seemed to stand still in quiet honor. Across the ceremonial platform, the people of the Tariani gathered, wearing woven sashes of firelight thread, their faces calm, their bodies painted in the symbols of union. Some carried instruments made of bone and crystal, and others simply stood with palms pressed together in the ancient gesture of witnessing. Above them the sky sang with the soft sound of wind bells strung between the high cliffs, ringing out in waves that rolled across the land like a lullaby from the star scale. And stood before the unity flame, dressed in a robe of silver gray lined with markings that told the story of his journey from outsider to bonded. His hands were bare and unshaking, his eyes steady, not because he knew what the future would hold, but because he had accepted everything he had learned, that love was not born from certainty, but from trust and choice and presence. Beside him stood Reka, her armor replaced by the ceremonial gown of her lineage, deep crimson embroidered with the twin branches of fate and fire, her hair braided with the same beads worn by her ancestors, her shoulders straight, her gaze filled with something that had never been there before, not pride, not command, not defiance, but quiet peace. The elder of voices stepped forward, holding the ceremonial arrow wrapped in silk and energy. The air around it shimmered with light, not of technology but of spirit. The arrow was handed to Reka, who stepped into the center of the ring, where the stone beneath her feet glowed. In response, she raised the bow crafted from beast bone, and breathed slowly and with reverence, and her fingers brushed the arrow shaft as she drew it back, not with force, but with memory, not for battle, but for meaning. The crowd fell into silence as the arrow was loosed, soaring upward in a perfect curve, arching toward the rising light where the suns met on the horizon. Callan watched its flight not with fear, but with full heart, and when the arrow began to descend, he moved not quickly, not dramatically, but with calm purpose. He lifted his hand and caught it the way he had once done, without knowing, now with full knowing, with full choice. The arrow stopped in his palm, a heartbeat held between sky and earth, and the silence that followed was not from shock but from wonder. The flames rose high in response, their color shifting from orange to deep blue, The color of a soul recognized the elder of. Voices declared the bond complete, not by law, not by force, but by two willing hearts who had journeyed through storm and shadow to arrive here. As one, the crowd let out a sound that was not a cheer, but a breath released as if the planet itself had exhaled. Reka turned to Callan and offered her hand, and when he took it, their palms pressed together, and a soft glow spread from their joined skin across the stone platform and into the sky, where it painted the clouds with silver threads that lingered like lines drawn across the heavens. The ritual was done, but the story was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, they lived not as symbols, but as partners. Reka returned to her role among her people, not just as a warrior, but as a voice for unity and strength that did not rely on blades alone. Callan continued his work as a medic, teaching young healers new methods and learning from the ancient ways of the Tariani. Their home was built on the edge of the cliffs where sky met stone, and from their window, they could see both the stars above and the roots below, a reminder that love, like the strongest tree, grows in two directions at once. Sometimes, at night, they would sit beneath the twin moons, speaking of Earth and Tarian, of the strange ways fate moves, of arrows caught in paths unplanned, of the moment when two lives collided, and something impossible was born, not from tradition, not from command, but from the simple, quiet truth that sometimes the most powerful bonds are the ones no one sees coming, and yet once formed, cannot be undone. And so the story of Callan and Reka passed into song and stone, not just as a tale of marriage by honor, but as a legend of love, chosen freely between stars and carried in the hearts of those who believe that even in the coldest places of war and ritual, there can grow warmth deep and lasting when two hearts meet, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as equals bound by more than fate, by the decision to stay, by the choice to understand, and by the courage to love where no love was meant to grow. The end.